great. Everything gets silent. We seem to have to move on to our lecture for today. Welcome to our second Alexander von Humboldt lecture in this year's program on making European spaces. Welcome also to the many students from our different bachelor and master courses, for who this is one of their core themes in their courses. Welcome also to the other guests from here and from elsewhere. And last but not least, also welcome to our today's guest, Professor Luiza Bialasiewicz. Hope that's correctly pronounced. From the Department of Geography of the Royal Holloway University in London. Although we over and over experienced it in daily life and sometimes even in academia, one still seems to think in a rather enclosed categories and spatial scales. So issues at local Nijmegen scale are then seen as just and only local issues, or issues at a national scale, in this view, are exclusively an internal Dutch affair, etc., etc. In human geography and in many other spatial sciences, we have now come to the insight that this view is an illusion and does not pay credit to the complexity of today's world relationships. The local is present at many scale levels at the same time, as also the global is part of these phenomena we traditionally saw as being purely local. The local, regional, national and supranational are intimately linked together and codependent to each other. In this framework, dealing with the spatial structures of today's world, intervening in them, or even ordering, organizing and governing these spaces also becomes a very complex business. So making European spaces and understanding the complex processes through which European spaces are constructed, reconstructed and changed, thus also becomes a complex endeavor, which does not only involve the physical structuration and ordering of space, but also managing the way we identify with places and the way we differentiate places. It then also becomes clear that those principles and identities we care for within European borders are put in a totally different daylight if we are talking about the relationships of Europe with non-European partners. Spaces, places and their relation differentiations and borderings and otherings are also at the core of today's lecture by Luiza Bialasiewicz. She will talk about the relationship of Europe with the rest of the world, about the geopolitics and management of borders, and she is a political geographer and as such an expert in this field, and she has written numerous publications about European internal and external border issues, has also co-authored a piece with our first Alexander von Humboldt lecturer this year, Professor Stuart Eldon, who provided us with a detailed genealogy of territoriality. It's a basic concept in making space. And we are very happy that she is willing to share her expertise with us here. So let us listen to Luiza Bialasiewicz with her talk on Europe in the world, EU geopolitics and the management of borders. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Huib, for this introduction. Let me see if I can get the presentation launched here. There we go. I presume if I click start in Dutch will be start as well, right?
Just press F5.
F5, thank you. Nothing is happening. There we go.
You want to go to the
Just do the presentation, please. Wonderful, thank you. All right. you'll see that I've got actually a dual affiliation here because in these months I'm actually a research fellow in Torino in Italy at the Institute, actually International Center for Economic Research is the official name, and they have asked me to kindly flag it up wherever I go, so that's the dual affiliation. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me here. It's really a pleasure to be part of this series. I think one of the kind of daunting things about coming to Nijmegen to talk about borders in Europe, it's probably one of the more difficult places to do so, just because there's such a long tradition here of work on borders, both through the Center for Borders Research, through the Center on Migration Law. So, I find myself in certainly a very interesting context to bring my research to. Second point, I guess I want to start with, and you'll see the quotations that are up there, is that I realize that I'm following in some very illustrious footsteps, because it is here, as part of this lecture series in 2004, that Etienne Balibar gave his lecture on Europe as borderland. So, kind of following on from Balibar and trying to talk about Europe and borders is a difficult task. But having said that, I thought it would be very appropriate to start with a couple of citations from Balibar himself, because I think they highlight very nicely the main kind of themes that I want to focus on today. The first is the changing nature of borders. And again, I'm not saying anything new here, especially to an audience such as this one. But what I will try to highlight throughout is the fact that borders are increasingly moving away just from the territorial confine. They're being debordered, as many people have termed it, moving both inside, within the nation-state territory, but increasingly also beyond it. Okay? So this is the first point, and I think Balibar's words are eloquent to this extent. But the second point, and kind of the title of my lecture aims at that, is the question of the political effects of these changes. Okay? The fact that the making of borders, or border work as I will refer to it, using a term coined by a colleague of mine at Royal Holloway, Chris Rumford, border work is increasingly becoming a very powerful political and geopolitical technology, a very powerful geopolitical tool, particularly in the case of Europe. Okay? If I move away from the microphone, can you hear me? Yes? Okay, tell me if you can't hear me. The title of this series is Making European Spaces. And what I will try to do is think about how making borders, how border work more broadly conceived, actually makes spaces for Europe, is a geopolitical tool for the EU to make spaces, to make its spaces of action, extend, let's say, its spaces of influence, and so on. A few years ago, French political sociologist Zaki Laidi argued that it is at borders, through the EU's border work, that we can best perceive what he called the distinct aesthetics of European power. And you'll think, what does he mean by this? Okay, he was referring to a very particular, what he thought of understanding of power. That has been termed with many different kind of epithets by other people. The idea of a normative power, a soft power perhaps, the power of attraction, but this is what he was referring to. He's not the only one to have identified Europe's border work as a very important form of political geopolitical technology. Other writers, such as William Walters, have explicitly written about it as a geopolitical technology, as a way of projecting geopolitical power, of asserting geopolitical power. Or, even more directly, others have written of the EU's border work or border making as let's say, a modern form of a translatio imperi, of extending empire, of making imperial spaces. Okay? Now, the problem with Europe, and maybe I should stop here and say what I mean by Europe. When I say Europe, I actually mean the European Union. This is not to say that the European Union represents Europe as a whole. You all know that, okay? So when I say the word Europe, think of it as Europe, EU, Europe, okay? The EU representing Europe. I'm talking about the institutional representation, the institutional form that Europe takes, okay? What is particular about Europe, and why does it make a very interesting case, certainly for political geographers? A colleague of mine, political geographer, who is now in Amsterdam, James Sidaway, a few years ago wrote a paper talking about the EU as a very particular beast, okay, a very curious beast. And I like that characterization because it is a very difficult beast, a difficult creature to understand. If only, precisely in its border work, for one, okay, there is no single bordering institution. Okay? There is no European Department of Homeland Security. The EU's border work, as many of its policies, proceeds through a very kind of fluid series of assemblages of institutional structures that change, shift, multilateral, bilateral agreements, a kind of shifting geometry that is deployed when necessary and then very often kind of fades away. Some theorists, scholars, most prominently Didier Bigot, have talked about it as a kind of virtual border governance. Okay, there's really kind of no single actor that we can pinpoint. And I will argue that actually this is what makes it not only interesting but also quite powerful. The other citation that you see here comes from the late Pierre Bourdieu. It's an older citation, but I think it is very much to the point in identifying the very kind of ambiguous and slippery nature of European power and also of its border work. He said, "Europe does not say what it does not do what it says." It sounds like a tongue twister, but actually I think it's very much spot on. It says what it does not do, and it does what it does not say. Okay? And when we start talking about some specific cases of border work, you will see why this is very, very true and very, very problematic. So what I will try to do in the presentation is to identify who is doing what, okay, and where, and especially what I'll try to highlight are the political and geopolitical effects of this, and what this means for the EU as a particular geopolitical actor, what this means for the EU as a normative actor. Okay? I'll try to structure it in kind of 3 steps. I'd like to start out by saying a little bit about this idea of Europe, not necessarily as a normative power. I don't really like that term much. What I like better is a term coined by Jan Zielonka, which is the empire by example, okay? And the ways in which the EU, as an empire by example, does its border work specifically in its neighborhood, okay? After that, I want to focus on the question of migration specifically, because border work is not just about managing migration, it's not just about stopping migration flows, it's about many other things. But I want to focus specifically on migration, and in particular on the new remote control and offshore solutions that the EU has been deploying in recent years. Okay? And finally, to wrap up, I'll try to think about what these various policies, these various forms of border work mean for Europe as a normative power, as an empire by example. And hopefully, I mean, what I will try to end with is actually some questions to you about what you make of these practices. So let's start with this idea of empire by example. Now, as I said, the EU's border work does not stop and is not limited to the management of migration. The EU has been extending its spaces of action, okay, and making borders in its immediate neighborhood for quite some time, and the Balkans were the first kind of space of experimentation for these policies, both in terms of making borders, but also in making states. Okay? I mentioned Jan Zielonka, who is a co-national colleague at Oxford, because, as I said, I think his notion of the EU as an empire by example is quite useful. Looking at what the EU has and had been doing in the Balkans, but not only, he suggested that the EU extends its geopolitical influence by what he called as the kind of export of regulatory regimes. So not invasion, not occupation, not even economic colonization or even political colonization, although you may say that has been kind of following along anyway, but what he calls is the creation of semi-protectorates, not formal protectorates, okay, but semi-protectorates, protectorates in the sense that these are states, okay, whose legal infrastructures, normative infrastructures are led by EU norms and modeled on EU norms. And the idea of the empire by example follows from that. What he says is that the legitimizing strategies of the EU do not follow the usual motto of strength, okay, so might makes right, but rather the EU legitimizes its policies by claiming that its norms are right and so should be followed, okay. So in post-Dayton Bosnia, in Montenegro, subsequently in Kosovo, the EU has built institutional legal infrastructures, including border infrastructures, and that has been a very important part of that, but has literally made states at its external boundaries. And I'll stop for a second to talk about Kosovo because I think it's an interesting case. It's an unresolved case as yet, as you will know. Not even all of the EU 27 states have recognized Kosovo as an independent state. So it's not a fully completed project in that sense. But I think, kind of going back to Bourdieu's idea of the ambiguity of EU action, I think it's an excellent example. The EU set in many ways the terms of the Declaration of Independence, recognized, as I said, not all EU states, but it was EU institutions that led the independence kind of agenda, of course, with the aid of the Americans as well, okay? Without any formal right to do so, okay? In fact, and what those of you who know something about the Kosovo kind of conundrum will know that it was a very difficult case under international law and a very ambiguous one. Okay, the EU's involvement was kind of equally ambiguous in that sense. These are pictures that had been taken on the streets of Pristina right before the Declaration of Independence by Associated Press photographers. And what you would see is not only British and American flags, but EU flags hanging with the EU along with the British and the Americans, being thanked for leading Kosovo to independence. So again, this idea that the EU somehow would lead state-making endeavors. Okay? In Kosovo, to add to the ambiguity, is very interesting because the various leaked, this was before the era of WikiLeaks, various leaked information actually indicated that although this was being sold as an EU initiative, it was the Americans that were actually not only deciding when independence should be announced, but actually were giving directives to the then Slovenian presidency of the EU on how this should happen. So when we're talking about the EU role in the Balkans and elsewhere, we should also keep in mind the role of other powers. But let's leave it aside, okay? Those were the early days, but what I find more interesting is what has been happening more recently. After the supposed Declaration of Independence, stabilization, the removal for a large part of the UN forces, the EU sends in its own mission called EULEX, okay, whose explicit aim is, quote, pacification and stabilization of Kosovo, but also what is called as normalization, whatever that will mean. Most directly, what normalization means, not only making this a normal state, but literally incorporating Kosovo into the European normative and legal and regulatory space. Okay? What is EULEX? EULEX is a force of almost 3,000 people, not soldiers, but civil servants, police, many border and customs officials, okay, into which 5 billion euros have been poured in since 1999. You saw the graffiti here, also from the walls of Pristina. EULEX has not been overwhelmingly popular, has been highly contested. EULEX headquarters have been attacked. But the aim here of this force is, with EU benediction, to bring Kosovo into the European regulatory space and prepare it eventually to enter into the Stabilization Association agreements that you will know is a way of bringing states into association with the EU. The first steps were curious, and I want to highlight these two because we're talking about borders. It was a complete revamping of the border and customs infrastructure, okay, and a push towards customs union with Albania, okay, and especially assuring that Kosovo, okay, would somehow become a properly bordered state. The picture that you see here is actually a map that comes from an Italian geopolitical magazine, and I don't think I need to translate it for you. It says Armeria Kosovo, or the Kosovo Armory, and what it shows is this idea of a kind of weak, failed, whatever you want to call it, state, punctured by various dangerous flows of arms that need to be contained, okay? So this preoccupation with stabilizing Kosovo was also a very strong preoccupation about controlling the various flows that go through the Balkan space, and in this case, Kosovo, okay? But Kosovo is just one example, and you may say that it's a very kind of particular example. I presume all of you will have heard about the European Neighbourhood Policy, a very important policy tool of the EU in establishing relations with its immediate neighbourhood. The famous Ring of Friends, as Romano Prodi referred to it a few years back, okay? When the European Neighbourhood Policy was launched in 2003, the idea behind it was, and you see the quotation here, to promote stability and prosperity within and beyond the borders of the Union, okay? So to create new linkages, but also, and this was a very important kind of political tool, to establish new forms of association with states that certainly in the near future could have no hope of accession, okay? So to offer a different form of association. I'll show you a little map of the ENP here that, again, most of you will be familiar with. You will see that the ENP spans not only the southern shores of the Mediterranean, but also the eastern borderlands, and now increasingly stretches into Central Asia as well. As I said, the main intention of the ENP originally in 2003, so about a decade ago, was to kind of create partnerships, help promote democracy, help promote the norms that the EU is supposed to encourage in its neighbor states. But that role has increasingly changed. And again, in thinking about the ways in which the promotion of norms is increasingly being used for very different purposes, the ENP is an interesting case to look at. Over the past few years, especially over the past 3-4 years, the ENP, the neighbourhood programme, has explicitly been identified as a way of securitizing Europe, of protecting Europe from hard threats. So not just a partnership, but something very different. Literally, the neighbourhood programme, the Ring of Friends, has become a ring of buffer states and increasingly policemen. Somebody here at Nijmegen, actually, Elspeth Gild, who's a professor in the Centre for Migration Law, carried out a study for the Centre of European Policy Studies just this year, looking at the changing nature of the ENP. And what she found is something quite distressing. While initially it was, in fact, a tool for partnership building, a tool for building kind of linkages, it is increasingly becoming a security tool. Okay? And in particular, what the ENP policies are about, as she says, it's the emphasis is increasingly on placing obligations on the neighbours to act as a buffer between the EU and other third countries as regards irregular migration, through exchanges of information, monitoring of migration flows, and so on. what are the consequences of this approach? The consequences are quite dire, because rather than spreading these notions of partnership and a shared European space, what the ENP is increasingly doing is creating new dividing lines where Europe's neighbours are increasingly asked to act in a coercive capacity, okay, against their own neighbours. Instead of reinforcing solidarity in the region, such approach is likely to create tensions and instability. And if you're interested in these issues, I would strongly urge you to look at Elspeth Gill's work, because I think it's probably the best that there is in looking at these changes. In thinking about this, I'll point you to one particular example. One particular example that the EU has been using as one of these kind of model neighbours, and it is Moldova. You'll say, what, why Moldova? Moldova is a bit of a kind of a joke in political geography circles, because it's usually the country none of our students can identify. They kind of place it somewhere in the ex-Soviet space, but it has become a very important kind of strategic point for the EU, and the focus of these new border-making initiatives. If you go to the European Commission's website, to the external relations pages, you will see that there is a lot of information on Moldova and on the European Union's border management program called EUBAM. EUBAM is the European Union Border Assistance Mission to Moldova and the Ukraine, and you'll see the pictures that are here are from the launch of the EUBAM mission with Javier Solanas in 2005, so quite some time ago. Moldova is being seen as a model partner for the EU through this mission, precisely because it has embraced this idea of neighbours working in partnership with the EU to provide this new kind of security architecture. Now, the role of the EUBAM mission is quite interesting, and I think quite revealing of the new sort of border work that we're talking about. If you know where Moldova is, I'm sorry I don't provide a map here, I presume you all know where it is. You know that it is not an external border of the EU, because the border of Moldova that is being managed here is the border between Moldova and the Ukraine, not Moldova and Romania. Okay, so it is not an external border of the EU that this money is going to and that EU observers are going to. Okay, so very much part of this moving away of borders. What the EU is highlighting as unique about this project is the fact that here we see what the Commission itself calls a remote control border, okay, where EU experts are sent beyond the EU's external borders to manage flows at a distance. Okay, now of course, as I said before, there is no European border force. The body that is managing this is there in theory to observe, advise and assist efforts to facilitate proper mobility and impede illegal activities, but it is very much seen, as I said, as a model case. And the Moldovans themselves have seized very much upon this idea. Just 2 days ago, Moldova's Prime Minister was in Brussels and gave a couple of press releases talking about how his country was part of the European Union's global strategy of the management of borders. This is from the words of the Moldovan Prime Minister. Our aim is to become a contributor to the creation of a European space of liberty, security and justice. From next January, we will be the first Eastern partner of the EU to switch to the exclusive issuance of biometric passports. Moldova is an increasingly safe neighbour for the EU and a good partner in managing migration flows. So we're not talking about kind of the forced kind of transfer of norms, but here a neighbour that is very willingly, quite happily taking on this role and seeing it as a way of actually moving into the European space. Because what Vlad Filat says afterwards is he affirms that it is precisely through the participation in these activities, by acting precisely as Europe's policeman, that Moldova can assert its right as a European state. Moldova is a European country with European citizens. This factor determines our domestic and foreign policies in a much more substantial way than in the case of virtually all of our EU neighbours. Okay? And I want you to keep that in mind, because this is not thinking about kind of empire by example. It is this idea that that these norms, that this sort of border work is actively taken up by neighbours. You will say, yes, for very obvious kind of geopolitical reasons. It is a way of entering into the European space, of assuring perhaps negotiations into stability and association agreements and so on, but nonetheless this is what is taking place. Okay? That's at the eastern borderlands, okay, and I want you to keep that in mind. But I want to focus the bulk of my comments tonight on a different space, and it is the Mediterranean. The reason I want to talk to you about the Mediterranean is twofold. First, because that is where my own recent work has been focused, looking specifically at Libya, okay? But also because the Mediterranean has for a very long time been the space of experimentation, where the EU's border work in practice has for a very long time preceded any sort of institutional infrastructure, agreements, etc. Even the work of Frontex, okay, the various patrols that you will all be familiar with, those were taking place already long before the existence of Frontex as an agency, which was only founded in 2005. So the Mediterranean is a space for experimentation, but also the Mediterranean as increasingly Europe's graveyard. Okay, there are people in this room who've written extensively about migration in the Mediterranean, so again, I will not be saying anything new to you, but just to kind of drive the point across, over the past decade, there have been over 10,000 documented deaths at Europe's borders in the Mediterranean. This past June, on International Refugee Day, June 20th, there's a kind of United, which is a group of European NGOs that has been keeping what they call a list of deaths, counted the figure as 14,000. These are just the documented deaths, and certainly do not take into account those that have never made it, even to the shores of the Mediterranean to undertake the journey, or those who have simply disappeared somewhere in the desert. If you read the newspapers in Italy, in France, in Spain, over the past 10 years, these are the sort of images that would appear every summer. Boats filled with mostly men, but not only, undertaking the journey from the shores of Libya, previously from other shores, trying to make it across to Europe. In March of this year, both Time and Newsweek dedicated their covers to the failure of Europe to deal with the migration problem in the Mediterranean, noting that Greece, Italy, and Spain are increasingly losing the battle. Greece, as you will have probably been aware, is currently the focus of some of these tensions, but very much this idea that this is a challenge that the EU has failed to stand up to. The map that you see here is again a map that most of you will have seen in some form or another. Okay, it is a map produced by the UN and Frontex, the European Agency for the Coordination of the Control of External Borders. And what it does is it shows the various flows of migration flows that bring migrants from sub-Saharan Africa, but even beyond, to the shores to undertake the journey to Europe. I'm not going to comment extensively on this, but what I want to highlight here are the little green spots, because the spots highlight the sites of the EU joint border patrols at that time. As I said, this map is a couple of years old, and as the patrols have intensified, the flows have moved elsewhere. This is a more recent map from a Frontex presentation last year, and you will see that the flows that were once taking place quite heavily from the Moroccan coast or even from the Libyan coast are moving elsewhere. They're moving especially to Greece and Turkey. Okay, and you'll see the kind of the changing colors on the map. The reason I want to talk about this is not to talk only about the tragedies that are happening daily in the Mediterranean, but the EU's role in all of this, because the little green spots, these joint patrols, call up some very interesting questions, again, for us as political geographers and as geographers in general. This map is, again, from Frontex and shows again from a few years back, the patrols off the shores of Mauritania and Senegal. First, kind of immediate question, what are British, Italian, Spanish ships doing in Senegalese territorial waters? Okay. There are no existing legal bases beyond bilateral agreements, very often ad hoc agreements that allow for this. Okay. But there are two issues here. The first one, of course, is the increasing kind of militarization of migration controls. And if you look to Frontex's own kind of presentations, propaganda, the focus is very strongly about kind of the use of military means, helicopters, various other patrol vehicles, increasingly mobile devices. Okay, so these are trucks with mounted infrared and radar scanners, but also the ways in which the actions of Frontex and other EU agencies are portrayed are very much using military jargon, military terminology of operational planning, rapid response teams, or RABITs. Actually, there are rabbit teams deployed for the very first time right now on the Greek border to counter this emergency situation that is developing there. Okay. The ways in which the air border operations are portrayed is still very much using this sort of military rhetoric, which again raises some interesting questions regarding how migration threats are depicted. But beyond, I want to go back to this map, but beyond the visible military presence, Nicolas de Genova has a kind of nice term for it. He talks about it, the spectacle of militarized border enforcement. Beyond this visible presence, there's something else that's going on, which is even more important, and this is what I will want to focus on in the next few minutes. Beyond this visible presence, there's another set of shifts that are taking place that are equally profound and that are taking place within these states. Most of you will have undoubtedly heard of the Lomé Convention, which was signed many years ago as a way of regulating the terms of trade between the EU and 77 Asian, Caribbean, and Pacific, African, Caribbean, and Pacific states, the ACP states. Okay. When the Lomé Convention was up for renewal in the year 2000, okay, the EU insisted that as the convention was being renewed, the ACP states should reinsert a new clause regarding readmission and repatriation. Okay? So now the African states and the Caribbean states as well would be required, okay, to accept the readmission and repatriation of all of its nationals illegally present in EU territory, and also to fund such repatriation. Now, there weren't any kind of retaliatory measures put into place, but it was understood that this was going to be a very important part of the new convention. That was passed, and when the convention was up for renewal again this past summer, the terms under which this repatriation agreements were being enforced became even more tightly specified. The new kind of revised version of the convention was signed, although the African states refused to sign on Article 13, which had the kind of particular specifications regarding migration flows. Highlighting a very kind of problematic development here, and this is what the reason I want to highlight that it is not just about EU boats on Africa's shores, but about something much more profound. The fact that now it is not just a question of patrolling the waters, but the fact that African states themselves are being asked to enact these patrols to stop migration flows and to act with their neighbors and with other African states to ensure that illegal migration flows don't take place. And this is increasingly being tied to EU development aid. Okay? The quotation that you see here is again from a network of European NGOs that produced a briefing paper for European parliamentarians who were to vote on this agreement, noting to them how dangerous it was to tie European development aid to cooperation on border control. Okay? But unfortunately, this is exactly what has been happening. And the role of third countries in border control has become increasingly important. So it is not about, just as in the case of the ENP, of kind of transferring norms. It is of asking, we're talking here about asking other third nations, non-EU nations, to enter into this border work as partners, that's the language, okay, but very much as enforcers, okay. And the role of third countries is not something entirely new. The first kind of proposals date back again to 2003, unsurprisingly initiatives by the UK, Tony Blair's government, who had this brilliant idea for what was then called as offshore processing facilities that were to stop migration flows from reaching Europe. The idea was basically we would create centers in difficult, dangerous regions where migrants could turn to before undertaking the dangerous journey. And the rhetoric was very much that of care, of protection. Okay, so stopping migrants from undertaking dangerous journeys, offering them assistance, assessment of their asylum claims in situ, as it may be. Okay. The idea, as nicely as it was presented, was actually thrown out. When this was taken up to a vote, Germany and Sweden reacted quite strongly at these proposals and was never kind of fully incorporated formally into EU migration policy. But this idea of externalizing migration control and providing offshore solutions kind of crept into EU migration management techniques ever since. And also this idea of turning to third countries to somehow manage migration flows for Europe. What I want to do then is spend some time on a particular case that I think is quite revealing and highlight some of these ambiguities that I was noting at the outset. Okay? And it is the case of Libya that you may or may not have heard much about. If you live in Italy, you hear quite a bit about Libya because our Prime Minister is best friends with Muammar Gaddafi, and I'll show you some lovely pictures of them. The most recent things you will have probably heard about Libya come from WikiLeaks, and they regard Gaddafi's various predilections, his phobias, his liking for Ukrainian nurses, and so on. Okay, but I'll tell you some other things about Libya. But I assume that what you know about Libya does not immediately bring it to mind as the sort of partner that the EU would want to associate with in terms of assessing asylum claims or even helping manage migration. Libya is an interesting case to look at because it is such an extreme case and because, I will argue, it illustrates the complete failure of the European kind of idea of Europe as a normative power or as an empire by example. It's utter failure, I will argue. This is a quotation from Colonel Gaddafi on his visit to Libya in June 2009. He comes quite frequently to commemorate the so-called Italian-Libyan Day of Friendship, usually falling in the summer. And the reason I put it up is because I want, beyond the idea of Libya as a rogue state, there are some very concrete problems with asking Libya to manage Europe's migration. It is not a signatory to the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees. It has no asylum policy. The Libyan state has no asylum policy. It doesn't recognize the institution of asylum. It does not recognize the status of refugees. The claim of Libyan government officials is that all refugees, all migrants on Libyan territory are economic migrants and should be treated as such. Okay, and I'm not going to comment on the citation because I think it speaks for itself. So how does Libya get brought in to be Europe's partner, as it may be? The first Frontex mission to Libya goes there in 2007. And I will comment on that in a second, but doesn't institute any sort of formal agreement. And one of the kind of characteristics of the Libyan case is that there is no formal agreement to date with the EU, and the Libyans have been very careful not to formalize their relations. The only formal agreements that exist are with Italy. They're bilateral agreements that begin in 2007. a first agreement on migration controls is established based on the fact that most of the quite substantial migration flows that were reaching Italian shores, the shores of islands like Lampedusa, but not only, were coming from Libya. Okay? So Libya was identified as the potential partner in somehow stopping these problematic flows. And here we're talking about flows of up to 4,000 people a week in the summer on the island of Lampedusa in the past years. Okay. The important turning point comes in 2008 when Italy and Libya signed what is called the Friendship Treaty. This is a very important treaty because it's the first time that Italy, as an ex-colonial power, established a full set of relationships with Libya that brought both reparations of various sorts, but a formal agreement that specified that Libya would now be acting on Italy's behalf to monitor migration. What is instituted in 2008, and you see the picture here, are joint patrols, boats seated by the Italian Coast Guard that would operate with joint Libyan and Italian crews, or very often they have moved increasingly to just Libyan crews. So you see the Italian guards in the white uniforms and the Libyans saluting in their green revolutionary attire. Okay? The idea of the joint patrols was that the Italian Coast Guard, the Italian Guardia di Finanza, would somehow teach, still following on from the EU language of teaching proper border management techniques, would teach their Libyan colleagues how to properly patrol their shores and prevent the migrants from actually even undertaking the journeys, or if not, intercepting them immediately at sea. This is the first 2 years. What happens in 2009 is something even more far-reaching, and this is where I want to focus our attention on, because it is something quite novel. In May 2009, as part of a kind of generalized push by the Berlusconi government, an anti-immigration crusade, a number of laws are passed in Italy. The first set have to do with criminalizing illegal migration. Being an illegal migrant on Italian territory is now punishable with a fine of up to 10,000 euros and with detention. Okay? So illegality becomes a crime punishable by law and allowing for either deportation or detention. But as part of this law, Italy also puts into place what is called a new pushback policy, and it's the only one actually put into place so far in the EU. What does this policy mean? This policy is important because it throws into question the very notion of asylum provision, of refugee protection that all European states are bound by. Essentially now what happens is, if a boat carrying migrants enters into Italian territorial waters, which means 12 nautical miles, so not that much, the Italian Coast Guard will take them on board and escort them to shore. Any vessel that is intercepted beyond 12 nautical miles is immediately turned over to the Libyans or to these joint patrols. The Libyans are then charged with taking the boat, whether dragging the boat or escorting it or taking the migrants on board, and taking them directly to Libya, where the migrants' claims are to be assessed. I repeat, this is a state that has no asylum policy, that is not a signatory to the UN conventions. Okay? The quotations that you see here are from the Italian Ministry of the Interior kind of legal specifications for this policy. I don't need to tell you, how, of course, this policy works in practice. It has been very effective. In the period between January and June 2009, almost 8,000 migrants had reached Italian shores from Libya. In the same period this year, so between January and June of 2010, that number had come down to 750. Okay, so 90% reduction. So obviously the policy is working, but at what cost? Okay, as I said, the idea is that unless you literally make it to the Italian shore, the Italian Coast Guard, Guardia di Finanza, which is a kind of tax police, basically have outsourced, turned over all monitoring activities either to Libyan vessels themselves or to these joint patrols. The Council of Europe and the European Parliament, of course, launched immediately investigations of this policy, since it was clearly presented a number of dangers and a number of problems, legal also problems, and sent in a mission in 2009 after this policy had been going on for a few months. And the report of this fact-finding mission was finally published this spring. With something quite unsurprising, unfortunately. What they note is that the authorities interviewed acknowledge that they do not proceed with the formal identification of migrants who are intercepted at sea and pushed back, noting that no migrant has ever expressed the desire to ask for asylum. I mean, you have to think, these are people who have probably traveled for months sometimes, for weeks. Okay, certainly no state to ask in Italian or English or any other language for asylum procedures. I'm happy to talk more about this in our questions, because there are all sorts of other implications here. But of course you will ask, why is this being allowed to happen? How is it that a European state, and note, I'm not talking about the EU doing it, this is an EU state through bilateral agreements that is carrying out these policies, okay? How is this possible? Interestingly enough, the Italian Ministry of the Interior says that it has the full legal grounding to do this under a number of conventions. The first one is the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime and Smuggling, and then a series of treaties specifying collaboration in the fight against terrorism, organized crime, and regular migration. Okay? So rather than talking about policing of migration flows, what we're talking about here is protection against terrorism, protection against crime, with the target being the people smugglers. Okay? This, of course, is in clear violation of the principle of nonrefoulement, okay, that you will be familiar with. The fact that both under the 1951 Convention and under European Convention of Human Rights, no European state can push back anybody who will risk being returned to their state where they may be persecuted or risk their life. Okay? So this is clearly in violation of this. Clearly in violation of EU legislation on refugee protection as well. Which is applicable not only to the actions of EU states, but also to third parties acting on behalf of the EU. Okay? So, again, how is this allowed to happen? I'm conscious of the time here, so I'll close with a few points. As I said, we can't say this is the EU doing this, and you'll say, why are you bringing this example? This is a bilateral agreement. It is a bilateral agreement. But I bring it to you because I think, again, it's part of the fluid, flexible, and ambiguous way in which the EU does its border work, precisely through bilateral agreements, sometimes even non-existent agreements. And in the case of Libya, it is exactly this ambiguity that is at work. I mentioned the Frontex mission that goes to Libya in 2007, and I want to read you a piece of it because I think it's quite indicative of the way the EU has seen its relations in this sense. At the end of the report, the EU rapporteurs who go to Libya and assess the situation of migration flows traversing the Libyan desert and the challenges faced by the Libyans. This is their conclusion. Border control and management of such a vast area, the desert area, but also the wide sea border, cannot be achieved by applying existing EU standards. There's a need for a fresh approach to determine how best we can manage this challenge. And how is this being managed? As you may have perhaps heard, Gaddafi on all of his recent trips to Europe has been quite explicit in asking the EU, asking Italy, but asking also European institutions for help in managing the migration flows that are traversing Libya. He has actually, in his last visit to Rome, he memorably said that there are 5 million migrants within Libya, and if Europe, quote, does not want to become a black continent, it needs to do something about it, because he's very happy to reverse this tide onto European shores, okay, quoting textually. And what he has asked for is 50 billion euros, okay, you will say just an outrageous amount, actually the amount of all EU development aid to help Libya police migration. Well, he hasn't received that, but he has received something. As you all know, walls are increasingly popular in terms of managing borders and managing migration, and Libya is getting just exactly that. In October of last year, a project was approved, half funded by the EU, half by the Italian state. It is going to be an electronic wall, not a real wall along Libya's southern border, but an electronic wall that is supposed to be put into place, built by an Italian state company, curiously enough, that got the bid, okay. What it will consist of, the company is called Celex, and if you're interested, you can go to their website, and they already have the nice kind of propaganda brochure about what they will accomplish. Monitoring centers in Europe, okay, so remote sensing, GPS satellite data that will monitor flows, mobile detection devices, and my favorite, drones, okay. You may laugh, but actually the question of drones is a very serious one, and in the UK Home Office, a recent document was just published against the dangers of using unmanned vehicles for border control and the various problems that this may bring out. So the idea of kind of using unmanned drones, previously used for military use, now being transferred to policing borders is a quite serious one. I couldn't resist to show you this. Pictures from this August when Gaddafi was on his annual visit to Rome with Silvio Berlusconi. This is the day of Italian-Libyan friendship. And it is in this occasion when he again reiterated his call for Europe to basically cough up money to help Libya in its struggle against these mass migration flows that they're quite happy to help with. I've mentioned before that there is no formal agreement regulating EU relations with Libya to date. When the latest mission went to Libya a few months ago, Cecilia Malmström and a couple of other people went to speak with Gaddafi's representatives. They were literally kind of held at arm's length and told that Libya prefers not to formalize its relationship with the EU, but to work on an ad hoc basis, asking for funding where necessary, collaborating when necessary, but did not want to be bound into an agreement. In fact, Libya is not part of the European Neighbourhood Programme, it's not part of the Union for the Mediterranean, none of these initiatives that somehow bind the other states into the European neighbourhood. More recently, just to let you know that this is a kind of ongoing issue, when was it? The beginning of this month. Irish company just sold to Libya a comprehensive radar monitoring system, also paid with EU funding. Okay, it will be the most sophisticated maritime patrol system ever. Okay, and again, if you go on the Transas Marine website, you will see advertisements for this great mission. And apparently Libya will have one of the most modern and efficient monitoring programs in the world. Okay, what does this mean for Europe? Okay, and I want to close, as I said, with a kind of couple of considerations on what this means for Europe as a supposed normative power, if you want to call it that, or an empire by example. How is it possible that a state like Libya is being increasingly financed not only by EU states like Italy through bilateral agreements, but with EU funds, actually is having financed various measures that are there to bolster its borders and to somehow bring it into kind of part of this kind of offshore migration control. What I would argue, and again I'd be curious to hear your reaction on this, is that this marks a failure of European power, if anything. If we are to believe this idea that Europe's power of attraction is based around this idea that it is a normative actor, it is a good geopolitical actor in inverted commas. Okay, this idea of an empire by example that Zielonka writes about. Surely that power, this idea of the EU as an attractive power, surely that power wanes when we begin to apply flexible norms, flexible standards. Okay? And in the case of Libya, I think it is actually wrong to think of it as just one more example of offshoring or externalizing migration controls. If we think of places like Moldova or even the Ukraine that have been very active in policing on behalf of the EU, the eastern borders, okay, intercepting migration flows, instituting asylum processing centers, and so on. There, yes, we can talk about externalization. In the Libyan case, it is something completely different. A colleague of mine, Luiza Bialasiewicz at the Open University, has been doing some work on Libya in the past years. And what she argues is that actually what we are looking at here is not externalization at all. We're talking about, and I think it's hopefully clear to all of you, a complete retraction of the right to asylum, or even the right to rights that the European space of law supposedly assures. And this is something quite problematic. If, again, Europe's power, if you want to call it normative power, again, power of attraction, however you want to characterize it, if it proceeds precisely through norms, through particular political, geopolitical technologies based within ideas of partnership, very often based also with a very kind of specific managerial discourse, because certainly in the Eastern neighborhood and also in the Mediterranean neighborhood, it's all about certain standards, certain norms that are transferred to the neighborhood countries, okay? Very much a form of political power as well. Particular forms of expertise that are presented as ethical expertise or ethicalized stylings of government, okay? So very much, again, this idea of partnership and dialogue. Here we see its complete failure. Here we see its complete retraction. So rather than a kind of externalization of governance and then extension, a making, if you want to call it, of EU space, we see something very different. Nick Vaughan Williams refers to this kind of proliferation of these spaces outside of law or beyond law at Europe's borders as the production of an archipelago of zones of juridico-political indistinction, and Libya is just one such black hole. And again, I insist on this idea that this is a failure of EU power, because I think it's very interesting that it is in the case of Libya that this is happening. The one country on the southern shores of the Mediterranean that really doesn't care about Europe's carrot, okay? That has refused to sign up to any European initiatives, and has rather taken this relationship into its own hands, both through its energy politics, but now increasingly using not only its gas and oil, but the weapon of migration as well. Okay, so I think, again, throwing this out to you, I think it's very interesting to think about how powerful Europe's kind of field of attraction really is, if the countries to which it is turned do not, let's say, fall prey to its fascination, let's say. I'll close with this because I think this is a question that for us as geographers is a very pressing one, and I think one that is still largely under-researched and under-theorized. What are the political, geopolitical implications of the extensions of this border work? This is a quotation that comes actually from a press conference that was given by a number of European NGOs in February of this year, noting that it is not only within the EU space that we need to look, but also beyond it, that member states' obligations cannot be seen as stopping within their borders, but that stretch beyond them as well. I'll stop here because I know I'm beyond time, but I'll be very happy to take your questions because there's certainly lots more to say on this. Right? Thanks.